You will be shocked to learn how this story ended. From the outside, our family life seemed flawless, almost idyllic. Emma and I had been married for 12 years, and we had built a life together that many would envy. We were in our mid-30s, living in a friendly suburban neighborhood where every face was familiar. Our 3 children, Anna, who was 11 and already showing a talent for music, Sarah, a lively 9-year-old who could light up a room with her laughter, and Max, our mischievous 6-year-old, kept us on our toes but filled our days with joy. Emma had a knack for making everything seem effortless. She worked as an events planner, a job that allowed her to balance her career ambitions with the needs of our family. I managed the local hardware store, which had been in Emma's family for decades, passed down from her late father. Her brother, Tom, had inherited the business but partnered with me to keep it running smoothly. While I handled the day-to-day operations, Tom, a sharp-minded strategist, took care of the finances and long-term planning. Family was at the heart of everything we did. Tom and his wife Rebecca lived a few streets away, and our families were inseparable. Every weekend seemed to turn into a gathering of some kind. Whether it was a barbecue in the backyard, a trip to the park, or even just an impromptu pizza night. Our kids adored their cousins, and the adults shared a bond built on years of shared experiences and mutual trust. Looking back, I realize now how easy it was to get comfortable, to assume that nothing could disrupt the harmony we had created. The first sign of trouble came when Emma and Rebecca began collaborating on a major charity project for the local community center. Rebecca, who was known for her ambitious ideas, had spearheaded a gala to raise funds for children's programs, and Emma, with her expertise in planning events, was the perfect partner. Their meetings became a regular fixture in Emma's schedule, often in the evenings or on weekends when the kids were asleep or occupied. At first, I didn't mind. I admired Emma's dedication to the cause and Rebecca's enthusiasm for making a difference. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice subtle changes. Emma seemed more preoccupied, her mind elsewhere even when she was home. Her late-night returns became more frequent, and her explanations of finishing up details with Rebecca grew thinner each time. One evening, as Emma was getting ready to leave for yet another meeting, I noticed her appearance. She had chosen a dress that was more fitted than her usual wardrobe, her makeup applied with a precision that suggested more than casual effort. I made a light-hearted comment about how she looked more ready for a night out than a planning session. She smiled, brushing me off with a quick kiss and a reminder not to let the kids stay up too late. I didn't think much of it at the time. Emma had always taken pride in her appearance, and I chalked it up to her wanting to feel confident in her work. But as I stood in the kitchen that night, tidying up after dinner, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something felt off. It wasn't just Emma's behavior. Over the past few weeks, Rebecca had been more evasive as well, her usual chatter replaced with vague updates about the gala. Tom, ever the optimist, dismissed my concerns when I mentioned them, saying it was probably just stress from managing a big event. Life carried on, and I busied myself with the endless demands of raising 3 kids, running the store, and maintaining our home. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that Emma's distance was temporary, and that her dedication to the gala would soon shift back to the family. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. The connections that once felt unshakable now seemed fragile, like threads stretched too thin. Little did I know, the events that would unravel our lives had already been set in motion. Several weeks passed. Emma's involvement in the charity gala grew more intense, consuming her evenings and weekends. It wasn't just the frequency of her absences, it was the shift in her demeanor when she was home. She seemed distracted, her mind wandering even during family dinners or quiet evenings with the kids. I'd catch her staring off into space, her fork paused halfway to her mouth, or her hand absent-mindedly twirling her hair. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd dismiss it, saying she was just tired or overwhelmed by the gala planning. Rebecca, too, seemed unusually distant. Normally, she was the kind of person who filled silences with chatter, always eager to share updates about her projects or funny stories about her kids. But now, she was curt, offering vague responses when I asked about the gala. She avoided eye contact when we were all together, and for the first time, I noticed how often she and Emma exchanged quick glances, as if sharing an unspoken secret. The first real jolt came on a Saturday morning. Emma had planned to take Anna to her piano lesson while I stayed home with Sarah and Max. As she was heading out the door, her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't seem to notice, so I glanced at the screen, assuming it might be Tom or Rebecca confirming plans for later. It wasn't. The message was from someone I didn't recognize, labeled only as P. It read, "Looking forward to tonight. Let me know when you're free to meet up beforehand." Emma returned to grab her phone, and I casually asked who P was. Her response was quick and rehearsed. She claimed it was a vendor for the gala, someone she was coordinating with for catering. Her tone was light, but her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. The answer didn't sit well with me. It wasn't unusual for her to contact vendors, but the tone of the message felt off. I didn't press her on it, not wanting to start an argument, but a knot of unease began to form in my chest. Later that evening, Emma told me she had another meeting for the gala and would be home late. I offered to drive her, but she waved me off, saying it was close by and she didn't want to disrupt the kids' bedtime routine. As she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. I called Tom, hoping he might provide clarity about the gala's progress. To my surprise, he mentioned he hadn't heard much about it lately. Rebecca had been tight-lipped, even with him. He laughed it off, saying she probably didn't want him meddling in her project, but the comment lingered in my mind. Around 9 p.m., I decided to call Rebecca directly. I told her I wanted to check on Emma and asked if their meeting was still going on. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before replying that Emma wasn't with her. She'd stayed home that evening to catch up on paperwork. The pit in my stomach deepened. I didn't call Emma or confront her when she returned. Instead, I waited, observing her carefully as she slipped through the door. She seemed calm, cheerful even, as she kissed me on the cheek and asked about the kids' evening. But the questions in my mind had multiplied. Where had she been? Who was P? And why had she lied about being with Rebecca? I started to notice other things after that night, little details that I might have overlooked before. Emma seemed to be more attentive to her appearance, choosing outfits that were a bit more polished even for casual errands. She spent more time in the bathroom, her makeup carefully applied even when she wasn't leaving the house. Rebecca continued to avoid direct conversations, brushing off my questions about the gala with vague reassurances that everything was on track. Tom seemed oblivious, caught up in his work at the store and their kids' activities. I felt like a stranger in my own life, piecing together fragments of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. The once unshakable bonds between our families began to feel tenuous, and I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could ignore the growing shadow that loomed over us. The unease gnawed at me, but I told myself I couldn't let vague feelings rule my actions. I needed specifics, something concrete to understand what was happening. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. It was a Wednesday evening, and Emma was out again, supposedly meeting Rebecca to finalize seating arrangements for the gala. I stayed home with the kids, trying to focus on helping Anna with her piano practice while Sarah and Max bickered over a board game in the living room. But my mind kept wandering. Around 8 p.m., Tom called me, asking if I could swing by the store in the morning to help sort a shipment that had arrived early. The casual conversation turned to the gala, and he mentioned how odd it was that Rebecca had been canceling their usual Thursday night family dinners to work late on the project. I hesitated before telling him what was really on my mind. I asked if Rebecca had mentioned meeting Emma that night. Tom paused, clearly caught off guard. He said Rebecca had stayed home with their kids. She wasn't working on the gala tonight at all. This wasn't the first time Emma had used Rebecca as an alibi, and now I had confirmation that it was a lie. I thanked Tom and hung up, trying to steady my thoughts. Part of me wanted to confront Emma immediately, to call her and demand answers. But a deeper part of me knew I needed to wait, to gather more before I acted. The opportunity came when I went to the laundry room later that night. Emma's coat, which she had carelessly draped over the washer, caught my attention. A small crumpled receipt poked out of the pocket. It was from a restaurant, a place neither of us had ever been, located in a part of town we rarely visited. I smoothed out the paper and stared at the details. The timestamp matched when she said she was with Rebecca, but the 2 glasses of wine listed told a different story. My hands trembled as I slipped the receipt back into her coat, careful not to disturb anything else. When Emma returned home an hour later, I forced myself to stay calm. She seemed relaxed, her face flushed as she kissed me and asked about the kids. I asked her casually how the meeting went, and she launched into a rehearsed-sounding explanation about table layouts and budget adjustments. It was all lies. I knew it, and yet I didn't challenge her. Not yet. The following day, I made an excuse to step out of work early. If I was going to find the truth, I needed to see it for myself. I waited outside the restaurant listed on the receipt, my car parked discreetly across the street. At first, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. The place was quiet, its clientele mostly couples and small groups. I was beginning to think I'd let my imagination get the better of me when Emma walked out of the door, her face glowing with a smile I hadn't seen in months. She wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize trailed closely behind her. He was tall, with sharp features and a confident air. He leaned in close as they stood near the entrance, saying something that made her laugh. My breath caught as I watched her lightly touch his arm, a gesture so casual yet so personal that it felt like a slap. They lingered there for a moment, the man pulling out his phone as Emma nodded, apparently agreeing to whatever he was suggesting. The way they interacted left no doubt in my mind. This wasn't some innocent work meeting or a casual acquaintance. There was familiarity between them, something unspoken but undeniably there. I clenched the steering wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to jump out of the car and confront them right then and there. But another part of me held back, knowing I needed to be sure of what I was seeing. I didn't just want to accuse Emma. I wanted her to have no room for denial. I followed them at a distance as they walked to the parking lot. The man opened his car door for her, and Emma slid inside with a smile, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. He got in on the driver's side, and they drove off together. I didn't follow. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, my heart breaking with every second that passed. That night, I lay awake next to Emma, listening to her steady breathing and wondering how she could act so normal, so comfortable, after what I had just seen. The woman I thought I knew, the one who had built a life with me, raised 3 kids with me, felt like a stranger. The next step was clear. I needed to uncover everything. The morning after seeing Emma with the stranger, I woke up feeling hollow. She moved around the house as though everything was normal, laughing with the kids, packing their lunches, and reminding me about Sarah's school play that evening. It was infuriating to see her so composed when I knew something was so deeply wrong. But I kept my thoughts to myself. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed to be absolutely certain before I acted. And I needed to know who this man was and how far things had gone. Later that day, while Emma was at work, I made a decision. I couldn't let the lies go unchecked any longer. I called the restaurant where she had been the previous night and posed as a patron who had left something behind. Casually, I asked the manager about the couple who had dined together at the time listed on the receipt. He described Emma and the man in detail, mentioning how they had seemed quite close. His words were a gut punch, but nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. They left together, but the gentleman returned an hour later to retrieve a scarf. They must have forgotten it wherever they went after dinner. Wherever they went. The implications hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. That evening, I arrived early for Sarah's school play, sitting alone in the parking lot as I tried to gather my thoughts. Tom's truck pulled up beside me, and he waved, looking as cheerful as ever. Rebecca wasn't with him. She said she's stuck at the gala venue, he said, climbing out of the truck. Some kind of last-minute crisis. Emma's with her, I think. The words sent a chill through me. I nodded, muttering something about how stressful big events must be. But inside, the gears in my head were turning. I decided to skip the play and head straight to the venue. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. Only a handful of cars were scattered around, including one I recognized immediately, Rebecca's. But there was no sign of Emma's car. I slipped into the building quietly, the echo of my footsteps the only sound in the dimly lit space. The large event hall was empty, chairs and tables neatly arranged for the upcoming gala. I wandered further, moving toward the back offices, when I heard voices. One of them was Rebecca's. I stepped closer, peering through the cracked door of a small storage room. My heart sank as I saw Rebecca, locked in a close embrace with a man who was most definitely not Tom. They were laughing softly, their bodies pressed together as if the rest of the world didn't exist. I stumbled backward, almost knocking over a stack of chairs. The noise startled them, and Rebecca's head shot up, her face pale as she caught sight of me. She stammered my name, her voice shaky and filled with surprise, as she quickly pulled away from the man and fumbled to adjust her blouse. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The look on her face said everything. The man, clearly panicked, muttered something about leaving and slipped out the back door before I could even process what was happening. Rebecca stepped toward me, her voice low and trembling with desperation. She pleaded with me not to tell Tom, insisting that what I had just witnessed was a mistake, something meaningless. Her words mirrored Emma's excuses in my head, and I felt a wave of anger and disbelief crash over me. I told Rebecca I didn't have time to deal with her mess and demanded to know if Emma was there. Rebecca hesitated, her face a mixture of guilt and anxiety. After a moment, she admitted that Emma had left early, explaining that she had remembered meeting someone, although her tone made it clear that she was not entirely comfortable with the confession. The confirmation hit me like a hammer. I turned and left without another word, Rebecca's pleas fading into the background. I drove around aimlessly for a while, unsure of what to do next. Then, on a hunch, I headed to the hotel near the restaurant where Emma and the man had been the night before. It was a long shot, but something told me I was on the right track. When I pulled into the lot, I saw her car immediately. It was parked near the side entrance, hidden from view unless you knew where to look. My heart pounded as I sat there, staring at the vehicle that confirmed everything I had feared. I made my way inside, my steps heavy with dread. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I walked past, heading toward the elevators. I didn't know what I would find, but I couldn't stop myself. On the third floor, I turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the hallway, Emma and the man were standing outside a room, their bodies close, their hands lingering on each other as they exchanged quiet laughter. She looked at him the way she used to look at me, her guard completely down. They kissed, deeply, passionately, and then disappeared into the room. The final thread of my trust snapped. I didn't sleep that night. After what I'd seen, there was no rest to be found. Only the weight of betrayal crushing down on me like a tidal wave. The image of Emma in that hallway, her lips on someone else, replayed in my mind with brutal clarity. But it wasn't just her. Rebecca's betrayal of Tom added another layer of anger and disbelief that I couldn't shake. By morning, my resolve was clear. Tom needed to know the truth. I called him early, asking if we could meet before heading to the store. He didn't sense anything unusual, his tone as cheerful as ever as he agreed to swing by my house. When he arrived, he greeted me with his usual easy smile, but it faltered when he saw my face. I asked him to sit, my voice heavier than I intended. As the words came out, I watched the color drain from his face. I told him what I had seen the night before. Rebecca locked in an embrace with another man, their laughter, their closeness, the connection that couldn't be mistaken for anything innocent. Tom's reaction was a mix of disbelief and fury. At first, he tried to defend her, saying there had to be a misunderstanding, that maybe it wasn't what it seemed. But as I recounted the details, the way she panicked when she saw me, the guilt written all over her face, he fell silent. When I told him about Emma, the betrayal hit even harder. He stared at me, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists as I explained how I had followed her, how I had seen her with another man. I told him about the hotel, about the kiss, about the lies she had told me, and the role Rebecca had played in covering for her. Tom stood abruptly, pacing the room as his emotions spilled over. He was furious, devastated, and confused all at once. He cursed under his breath, his hands running through his hair as if trying to make sense of the mess that had just been dumped on him. Finally, he turned to me, his voice trembling with anger. He said we needed answers, that we couldn't let this go unanswered any longer. When Emma and Rebecca arrived home later that day, they walked into a storm they weren't prepared for. Tom and I confronted them in my living room, our voices sharp with the pain of betrayal. Emma tried to act confused at first, her eyes darting between me and Tom as she stumbled over her words. Rebecca was quieter, her face pale, but the guilt was written all over her. When I laid out everything I had seen, the messages, the lies, the restaurant, the hotel, Emma's defenses crumbled. She admitted to the affair, though she tried to downplay its significance. She claimed it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, that it hadn't meant anything. Rebecca, too, confessed after Tom pressed her relentlessly. She tried to shift the blame, saying she had felt neglected, that it wasn't what Tom thought, but her excuses only fueled his anger. Tom's voice rose, the frustration and betrayal spilling out in waves. He demanded to know how long it had been going on, how she could do this to their family. Rebecca's answers were fragmented, her excuses weak and unconvincing. Emma turned to me, tears streaming down her face as she begged for forgiveness. She said she still loved me, that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she wanted to fix things. But her words rang hollow. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. I told her that she had destroyed everything we had built together, that her actions had ripped apart the foundation of our marriage and shattered the life we had created for our children. She tried to protest, saying she had made a mistake but still cared about our family. Tom echoed my words, telling Rebecca that her betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate act that had broken the trust they had shared for years. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke about their children, about the life they had built, and how her actions had jeopardized everything. The room was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, regret, and disbelief colliding in a storm that left no one untouched. By the end of it, both women were in tears, but the apologies and promises to change felt like too little, too late. The damage was done, and the lives we had once known were forever altered. The air in the room was thick with tension, every word spoken like fuel on a growing fire. Tom and I stood shoulder to shoulder, our anger palpable, our emotions raw. The betrayal was too fresh, the wounds too deep for any rational thought to take hold. Tom was the first to break the silence. His voice was cold, clipped, as he demanded to know who Rebecca had been sneaking around with. He stepped toward her, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. Rebecca, her face streaked with tears, hesitated, stammering something about how it didn't matter, how it was over. But Tom wasn't having it. He raised his voice, demanding the truth, saying he deserved to know the name of the man who thought it was acceptable to invade their lives and destroy their family. Rebecca flinched, her shoulders trembling as she finally muttered a name and an address. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Tom's rage deepened, his face dark with fury as he turned away from her, muttering under his breath. I turned to Emma, my gaze unwavering as I asked her where he was, the man who had stolen her loyalty, who had kissed her like I didn't exist. She tried to shake her head, mumbling something about it being unnecessary, but I stepped closer, my voice sharp and unrelenting. Where is he? I asked again, the words like ice. Emma's lip quivered as she lowered her head. She said he was at a gym across town, a place he often went after work. The words left her in a trembling rush, as if she thought getting them out quickly would somehow lessen the impact. Without another word, Tom and I exchanged a glance. No explanation was needed. We turned on our heels and made our way to the door, our footsteps heavy with purpose. Behind us, the women erupted into desperate pleas. Rebecca sobbed loudly, rushing after Tom, grabbing his arm as she begged him not to do something he'd regret. Emma stood frozen for a moment before following, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to stay. She swore that aggression wasn't the answer, that this would only make things worse. But her words fell on deaf ears. Tom and I strode toward my car, the women trailing behind us, their cries and protests growing louder as they realized we weren't stopping. Rebecca clung to Tom's arm, trying to hold him back, but he shook her off with a sharp motion, his expression hard. Emma grabbed my hand, pleading with me to think of the kids, to remember the man I was. I told her to let go. My voice was low, steady, and final. As we climbed into the car, Rebecca and Emma stood in the driveway, their faces pale, their tears unstoppable. I started the engine, and as we pulled away, I saw Emma collapse into Rebecca's arms, her sobs shaking her entire body. Tom and I didn't speak during the drive. The silence was heavy, charged with the weight of our anger. The first destination was Rebecca's lover's address, a small apartment complex on the edge of town. When we arrived, Tom's fury erupted. He stormed to the door, pounding on it with his fist. The man who answered the door, looking more stunned than afraid, barely had time to react before Tom pushed him back into the apartment. Tom's voice thundered as he demanded to know how the man dared to interfere in his marriage, to destroy the life he had built for his family. The man stammered out some excuse, but it was cut short when Tom's fist connected with his jaw. He stumbled back, his hand clutching his face, but Tom wasn't done. I pulled Tom back before things escalated further, but not before he delivered a final warning. He told the man to stay away from Rebecca and their family, to never show his face again, or there would be more to answer for. We left the apartment, both of us breathing heavily as we got back into the car. The silence lingered for a moment before Tom muttered, "Let's go find the other one." We drove to the gym Emma had mentioned, pulling into the lot and spotting her lover immediately. He was chatting with someone by his car, unaware of what was about to come. I walked up to him without hesitation, my blood boiling with every step. When he saw me, his casual demeanor shifted to confusion and then recognition. He raised his hands as if to defend himself, but it was too late. My fist connected with his face, the impact sending him stumbling backward into his car. He tried to speak, to offer some excuse, but I wasn't interested. I grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the vehicle, my voice low and full of rage as I told him to stay away from Emma and my family. Tom stood nearby, his presence a silent but heavy reminder of the shared fury we carried. The man nodded frantically, his face pale, as I released him with a shove and walked away. The drive home was just as silent as the drive out. We both knew what we had done wasn't the answer, but it was the only thing that felt right in the moment. When we arrived, the house was quiet. Rebecca and Emma were waiting, their faces streaked with tears, their eyes red and swollen. But neither Tom nor I looked at them as we walked past, our anger not yet cooled. Tom and I hadn't been back at the house for more than 10 minutes when we heard the knock at the door. It was firm, deliberate, and came in quick succession. My stomach sank as I exchanged a glance with Tom, both of us sensing trouble before we even opened the door. 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions serious. One of them spoke, informing us that they had received a report of an assault and that we were being placed under arrest. The words hit like a hammer. I glanced at Tom, whose face darkened with a mix of frustration and resignation. Rebecca's lover had called the police. The man Tom had punched in his apartment had decided not to let the matter rest. The officers didn't care about our explanations or the circumstances. Assault was assault. They placed us both in handcuffs, much to the shock and horror of Emma and Rebecca, who rushed to the door, their voices panicked as they tried to intervene. The officers calmly but firmly told them to step back. Emma grabbed my arm as they led me out, tears streaming down her face as she begged them not to take me. Rebecca clung to Tom, pleading with the officers to let him stay. Their cries faded into the night as we were taken away, the weight of our actions settling heavily on my chest. The next 3 days in a holding cell were grueling, not because of the confinement but because of the time it gave me to think. Tom and I barely spoke, the silence between us filled with unspoken regret. The initial rush of anger that had driven us was long gone, replaced by the cold reality of what we had done. When we were finally released, the relief was fleeting. The incident was behind us legally. Rebecca's lover had dropped the charges after realizing it wasn't worth pursuing. But the damage to our lives and relationships was far from over. Emma and Rebecca were waiting when we got home, rushing to us as we walked through the door. Emma wrapped her arms around me tightly, her body trembling as she apologized over and over again, saying how worried she had been. Rebecca did the same with Tom, her sobs audible as she clung to him. The tension didn't disappear, but the chaos of the past few days seemed to subside slightly. We were all too drained to fight, too exhausted to do anything but exist in the same space. Tom, unable to stay in the house with Rebecca after her betrayal, packed a bag that night and moved into a small rental near the store. For me, the days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, and hurt mixed with the faintest trace of hope that maybe, somehow, things could be salvaged. But every time I looked at Emma, I saw her with him. The memory of her lies, the touch of another man's hands on her, was too much to shake. Tom, on the other hand, began to soften toward Rebecca. He started spending more time at the house, talking with her, and gradually, the wounds between them seemed to heal. After a couple of weeks, he told me he was moving back in. He said he wanted to rebuild for the sake of their kids, to give Rebecca another chance. I didn't begrudge him his decision, but I couldn't follow the same path. Emma tried everything to make amends. She spent more time with the kids, cooked my favorite meals, and even suggested therapy. But I couldn't bring myself to see her efforts as genuine. The trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage was gone, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. I moved out shortly after Tom went back home. I found a small apartment not far from the hardware store and focused on my work, throwing myself into the daily grind to keep my mind from spiraling. Emma and I remained civil, for the sake of the kids, but I kept my distance emotionally. Every time I thought about filing for divorce, something held me back. Whether it was the hope that time might dull the pain or the fear of what it would mean for the kids, I wasn't sure. Months passed, and life took on a strange new normal. Tom and I continued to run the store together, though the closeness we once shared had shifted. He was happy again, or at least he seemed to be. Rebecca had convinced him of her remorse, and while I didn't entirely trust her, it wasn't my place to judge. As for me, forgiveness still felt like a mountain I wasn't ready to climb. Emma remained in the house with the kids, and I visited them often, spending weekends taking them to the park or helping with their homework. But I couldn't bring myself to stay long. The walls of our home now a constant reminder of what had been lost. Whether I would ever be able to forgive her, I didn't know. Time might dull the edges of the pain, but the scar would always remain. For now, I focused on the one thing that mattered most, being a father to my children and building a life that felt honest and true, even if it was without the woman I had once loved.